Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here today with another of our virtual events. And today we are going to be talking about Bonnie MacBird's brand new book here, The Three Locks, which I'm holding up. Hopefully you can see it. And joining Bonnie in the discussion is our good friend Leslie Klinger, noted anthologist, and what is it, annotatist?
Oh, that's a good word.
Annotator, the annotated Sherlock Holmes, the annotated Dracula, and so many other wonderful projects. And he's going to be doing the program with Barbara, who's tuning in from her home office. And as usual, I will be monitoring the Facebook comments, everybody. So if you have questions for Bonnie or Leslie or Barbara, just put them in the comments field, and I'll be coming back towards the end of the program to ask some of those questions. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Welcome, everybody. I'm holding up a copy of Three Locks, and I would like to say that Bonnie, who's joining us from an undisclosed location in England, Leslie in an undisclosed location in Southern California.
In Malibu, yes.
Right, in Malibu. Okay, I'm in Scottsdale. But anyway, Bonnie has very kindly signed book plates that come with your copy of this book. So that's a real treat. So this is the fourth book that Bonnie has written with Sherlock Holmes and Watson: Art in the Blood, Unquiet Spirits, The Devil's Due, and now The Three Locks. And we've been fortunate enough, I think, Bonnie, we've discussed all three of them, now the fourth, right?
Yes, we have, thanks. It's always been a pleasure to come to Scottsdale. Sorry I couldn't come this time.
Well, I'm sorry you can't do it because it's really beautiful here right now. And how's the weather in England? It's been kind of a weird year.
I don't know because I don't step out of our flat.
Oh, okay.
Not even an inch.
Right.
So
Well,
I just have to read the weather on the internet. It's been in the 50s and the 40s.
well, at the time of Holmes, people had to stay inside or, be clobbered by coal fumes and all the dirty fogs that London had. So maybe this is just kind of a variation. In any case, I am not a Sherlockian. And I'm so pleased that Leslie Klinger, who is not only a notable Sherlockian annotatist, anthologist, and the editor of the Haunted Library and the Library of Congress Crime Classics and many other projects, had enough time today to join us. So, Bonnie, why don't you give us a sort of short setup for the Three Locks, and then you and Les can do your Sherlockian thing.
Oh, well, thank you. The Three Locks takes place in 1887, and like all the other three books in my series, it can be read out of order. It doesn't really matter. They're standalones. The Three Locks pertains to three different cases that kind of convolve. The first lock is a locked box that arrives for Watson at the beginning of the story. It's from his late mother, and he thinks it has something to do that may explain her mysterious death when he was a child. But he can't open it. It's got an absolutely unassailable lock. They take it to all over to various locksmiths. The second lock is the Jesus lock, which that name just took me by surprise. What is the Jesus lock? Well, some of you may know, but it's a lock on the River Cam. It's a lock of the sort that changes the level of the river so boats can pass through. And I went and visited that place. It's a very exciting and kind of a dangerous place. And I thought that would be a very cool place to set an action scene, a sort of a denouement scene. And then the third lock pertains to an escape artist, a very famous fictional Italian escape artist who's making the rounds, and he's kind of a little bit based on Houdini, so he hangs into a water tank and does escape straitjackets and so forth. And it's about a murder that happens on stage in a locked container. So there's three locks, and that's what it is. It takes place in London and Cambridge.
Wonderful, proceed. So, Leslie, I know that you have read this book because your name appears on the cover. So
Yes,
would
I
you
have
like to
penetrating
say?
questions. I mean, I love the idea of interviewing a mystery writer where we can't really talk about the book because that would spoil it. So, I mean, we could just discuss the ending, but I think that's probably not the best way to approach this. So I was very disappointed, I must say, that it turned out to be those kinds of locks. I thought it was going to be along the lines of Robert Fisher's wonderful story, The Adventure of the Cardboard Locks, in which a device is invented to fax actual smoked salmon. And
Right.
so, no, there's no smoked salmon in this book. So.
And then there's these kind of logs.
Right, there's so many. So let's go back, Bonnie. When did you discover Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, eons ago in the prehistoric times, I was 10, and I took a book out of the library, and I read one story and I was totally hooked. And I then consumed the entire canon.
But
So.
you didn't get involved with organized Sherlockiana for quite a while.
No, you dragged me into that, Les. You personally.
I don't
did
remember a lot of dragging, Bonnie. I remember a lot of sort of tugging at the leash kind of dragging, you know.
Yeah.
But you've been writing also for forever. I mean, this is not book writing, but you started out. When did you start your writing?
I always loved to write all through school and so forth. And then at the university, I didn't study writing. I got a music degree and then a film degree, but I always knew I wanted to write for film. So once I was done with university, I started working in the studio system. Went to Hollywood, and I became a story editor. So that functions in Hollywood, a story editor for feature films. It functions very much like a book editor does at a publishing house. So I read many drafts of everything that was in development. I did copious notes and so forth. So I got a fairly good training in, I think, story structure doing that. And then I started writing scripts on my own. My first one sold and became Tron. And then I just sold a bunch of other scripts and did that for a while. So I've been writing for really a long time, actually.
So what was the impetus to write a book? I mean, obviously very different than screenwriting.
Yeah.
Out of your comfort zone.
It was definitely. It was a bucket list item. I don't have very many. I usually do what I dream about doing. But this was a real bucket list item. I tried writing a novel before I finished. I have one in a drawer, and it was a mystery novel, a private eye novel, because I love mysteries anyway. This is my genre. And it was a private eye novel, and there was one character, a policeman, who was a Sherlockian, by the way, in this novel. But that went into the drawer. And I really wanted to go at it again. And I got quite ill. And when I recovered from being ill, it's one of those moments in life where you go, wait, life is finite. You really have to think about what is it that you really want to do. And as I said, I didn't have a lot of bucket list items, but a novel was one. So I thought, okay, this is going to take a while, a year, maybe two. Who do I want to spend time in an empty room with? And it just came to me, and it was Sherlock Holmes. I had to write a Sherlock Holmes. I'd always wanted to. And then I realized just a couple of things. One, it's hubris, because I think Arthur Conan Doyle is one of the great writers. I really do. I think he's a genius. And so it's hubris to emulate that. And then the other thing I thought was, this is a hugely crowded market. Who wants another one of these? But I just decided I didn't care about either of those impediments. And then I wanted to write this. And I teach writing. I've taught writing for 11 years at UCLA Extension Writers Program, where I believe you've taught, Les. You've taught a Sherlock Holmes class there.
Of course, on Holmes and Dracula, yeah.
Oh, and Dracula too, yeah. And so I taught for 11 years screenwriting, and one of the things I tell my students is, they always say, write what you know. And I said, forget about that, write what you love. And so I took my own advice there.
In fact, you were so dedicated to this book. I mean, you thought about self-publishing it. I remember many conversations about take your time, go slow, be patient, and here you are, 4 books into deal with a major publisher, who is undoubtedly saying to you, so about books 5 and 6 now, how soon can we have them? Right.
Yeah, they take a while.
That's one of the big differences between traditional and self-publishing. Self-publishing, you can say, I'm busy. I don't feel like writing right now. Traditional, you have a contract. You better deliver that book. So
yes.
Are we ever going to see non-Sherlockian books, do you think? Do you think you've sort of built up those muscles now?
I have, and I have an idea for a spin-off series. Actually, it's also taking place in the same time period, because I have to say I love the late Victorian era. And I love mysteries. This is my genre and my era. Probably that's what I love the most. So yes, there will be other things, but I'm currently contracted to do a fifth book, so I'm working on that one right now. And I guess other people can do two at a time or really fast. I can't. They take me the time it takes. Three of them took 2 years each. The last one took 18 months, and maybe I can get it down a little shorter. But they're challenging because it's not only the story and you've got all the deductions. This stuff takes time, but also the research to really ground it in a time period and give texture and detail that is evocative and real. So they take a while, but I love doing it. So
Well,
eventually.
The bad news was you didn't get to do as much, what shall I call it, geographical research for this last book.
Right.
So the last book all takes place basically sort of in and around London, around we'll call Cambridge around. But so the first book is in Lancashire?
Lancashire,
And Paris?
Paris mainly. Yeah, and then the second book is Unquiet Spirits goes to the south of France, and then it goes to the Highlands of Scotland. And then the third book, The Devil's Due, is entirely in London, but all different areas of London, some of them not as so typically explored in fiction, and some fun detail about weird corners of London. And then this last one, The Three Locks, is London and Cambridge. And I just got in before the pandemic. I did a visit to Cambridge because I do what I call location scouting. And it's really just like for a movie. I go to basically find evocative, I do this early in the process, find evocative places and places that just speak to me and say, oh, I got to set a scene here, or this thing inspires me. So, in fact, weirdly, when I went to Cambridge at the Jesus Lock, a person had drowned in there the week before. That wasn't I already had that idea before I went there, but I mean, it is really actually a dangerous and scary place. So, and it's right in the middle of the most idyllic scenery. It's just really, really something. And Cambridge turned out to be vitally interesting. There's the Cavendish laboratories at that time. Well, they still are there. But at that time, they were doing cutting edge physics, like really, really exciting stuff scientifically. So lots of fun things came up.
So the next book will be set in your study here because that's the location you were able to research.
Right.
Can I interject something about Cambridge that I read today? I don't know if either one of you has been caught up in Monty Don and this whole gardening craze that has overcome England. He has a program about gardens. It's half an hour a week or something, and apparently is just riveting people. But today in the Wall Street Journal, he has incited a riot in the UK between people who want lawns, beautifully mowed and manicured lawns, and people who want them to go wild. And so wildflowers and the whole bit. But the reason I thought of it is that there's a big one in Cambridge, a beautiful lawn that apparently the college, whichever college the lawn belongs to at the university, has followed Monty Don and decided to let it go wild and all. And I thought, I remember Cambridge. I know the backs and how beautiful it is, with the lawns running down to the river Cam in the whole bit. We think of Oxford and we think of punting on the river and all. But anyway, I'm trying to imagine a less immaculate Cambridge with, thistles and flowers and everything growing up everywhere. But I thought, what a beautifully British fight.
Yeah, they get in arms over like hedgehogs and baking. It's really,
and daffodils. That's the thing that just we watched The Gardening World the other night, and I had no idea that there was competitive daffodil growing, and people went to, Les, you wouldn't believe it. People went to these incredibly sneaky lengths to give their daffodils a better shot at Best in Show. They're tying them up and they're doing little funny grooming and they're doing all this, and it's just fabulous.
As I recall,
Yeah.
Prince Charles is an avid gardener, or at least according
And
to the
Yeah.
Crown.
also in favor of the
Yeah.
wilding lawn.
Yes.
You know,
He said something like there are no straight lines in nature or something like that. So
Right. Well, he paints also. He's a watercolorist. Yeah. And a
and there's no
conservationist.
straight lines in watercolor either. Yeah, that's right. So
anyway, Cambridge is not very far from London. I'm trying to remember. It's a
No,
fairly short train trip and not
Yeah,
even that
no.
hard to drive.
Right. Yeah. I don't drive in London, in the UK though. It would be so confusing being on the wrong side of the road.
I have driven to Cambridge from London and back. I've also driven to Essex from London and back. It's really scary. You have to have an A to Z guide open. I mean, before GPS, you had to have the A to Z guide open in your lap and hope that while you were looking down to figure out why the street was only 1 block long and what to do next that somebody didn't clobber you. So, you know,
Right.
it's easier in the horse and buggy days, I'm convinced, when you hired hansom cabs and, you know, whisked around London that way.
Yeah.
yes,
one of the
well,
things that's great about
it's one of the few good things about those times. I mean, we have this false nostalgia for Victorian times, and I think, as Bonnie, you've gone to some pains to bring out in many of your books. It was not a golden age. At least you were a woman or a person of color or a servant. You know, it was not a wonderful time for all. It was, in fact, a very difficult time.
it was, and I think the homeless population in London was like 5 times what it is now. Yeah, it was a very difficult time, and although there were things set up for the poor, they were pretty awful. The largest workhouse in London was literally right behind the building I'm in. It's called the Marylebone Workhouse. It was like a little city, really. But the people who were housed there, I mean, felt it was almost like a jail. So it was very tough times. And like you said, if you were a servant, you were a woman, your options were very small. And so, you know, it's definitely true that female characters in my books, you know, are dealing with a different set of constraints certainly than we do now. And it's tempting to make them all be, you know, rebels and make them all be, you know, overcoming this, but it's not realistic either. So that's one of the challenges, I think, of writing Sherlock Holmes in the late Victorian era. Because I personally want interesting female characters to read. I mean, that's what I'd like in my books. But I can't make them all be, you know, extraordinary in that respect. But within their various constraints, I have women in all categories, basically, all strata.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, it's okay to write about extraordinary people. I mean, you know, writing a book about real life would be pretty boring.
Yeah, well,
So
definitely.
It depends, Les. Now, come on. It depends on whose life you're writing about.
well, that's, you know, that's true. But I mean, sort of ordinary life, you know, if something extraordinary has happened to an ordinary person, that's different. But
Well, if you're
to
George
say,
Eliot, ordinary life is fabulous. It's riveting if you're George Eliot, but I'm not.
yeah, but to, you know, to write a story about here's this lawyer who got up in the morning, read emails, answered a bunch of emails, talked on the phone, and then went to bed. You know, there's not much happening. So what does make a good Sherlockian book for your tastes, Bonnie?
What makes a good Sherlockian book? Is that
Yeah.
what you asked?
Yes.
I have a kind of list in my head of criteria that I want if I'm reading a Sherlock Holmes book, and it has to be true to the characters because they're genius. I mean, the creation is genius, the best friendship in fiction, and I think Sherlock Holmes himself. Not only do you have to get the characters right, their voices and the humor and everything, but I think Sherlock Holmes himself has to stay a bit of a mystery. Because that's one of the incredible appeals. I mean, it's the things that Sherlockians endlessly debate. And we don't know where he went to school. We don't know really about his childhood. There's so much we don't know. So if I'm extending the canon as I'm, you know, purporting to do, or, you know, aiming for the verisimilitude of it fitting into canon, then one of the things I have to do is keep that mystery. So I may reveal a few things that, you know, haven't come out before, but I can't penetrate that mystery of Holmes, or it's breaking the rules, you know. So that plus the other thing is deductions. The readers expect and demand good deductions. And there's two kinds of deductions I promise I will never do. One is a direct lift from the canon, the scratched watch, et cetera. And the other one is what I call the fake deductions. Like, I can tell by the left little fingernail that you were in Paris last week. It's like, no. It's like, no. They need to be real. And that is probably the single hardest thing about writing these.
As Conan Doyle himself said, it was darn hard to come up with those ideas all the time. And
Yes.
I think it's part of why he didn't like doing it.
Well, it is hard. And Mark Gatiss also said that about writing Sherlock, BBC Sherlock. He said the deductions were by far the hardest thing. He said he and Moffat were sitting on the train once and trying to come up with some for one of the ones that they wrote. And they said, okay, we see her and she's a woman. It's just really hard.
Well, I think it's gotten harder. I think that they had special challenges of the 21st century that,
Right.
we no longer have the marks on our knees or fingers that display our occupations. If you see typing calluses on somebody's fingertips, it doesn't tell you anything. They could be in any of 1,000 jobs.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody's typing now. The other thing is that you can't tell by how people dress anymore either. So if you walk down the real Baker Street right now, everybody's in a North Face jacket. The guy, the bazillionaire who owns the whole block south of there is in a North Face jacket, and so is the guy who works at Pret. So you can't, the clothing is no longer a marker.
Right.
So you can't tell now. So there's, it's quite different for the modern.
So it was a little easier in Victorian times, but
Yes,
I know
right.
you also have spent a great deal of effort on how do you describe it? The voice, but not just the voice, vocabulary.
Yes.
That you've always been very careful, I think, about using words that appear in the canon.
Yeah, I do make mistakes, and boy, do I get called on them. But by and large, I think I'm pretty accurate. And I do, when I'm not sure, I will check the canon is in one document. I'll check for that word, or I'll check an etymology, a dictionary, to see if that word was in common usage then, or when it first appeared. So I am pretty careful about that. And I try to really hear the voices, because Watson, speaking as Watson, because you're writing in first person as Watson, you really need his voice. And I'm really lucky because I love Watson, and I find him such a sympathetic man, and without ego, which is really interesting, because sometimes in getting the more flowery verbiage that the Victorians use, sometimes it's easy to creep into that, a kind of a pedantic flavor. But Watson is a very natural thinking, he's a man of action, so he isn't waxing poetic. He's not trying to impress you. He's just telling the story. Yeah, and so it, but given the Victorian sentence construction, so it's an interesting kind of tightrope to walk. But I love the man. I love the way he thinks about people. I like his perceptions of people. He's very perceptive, actually, very observant, in spite of what Holmes says, and the way he looks and describes people is it's almost kindly, really. He's a nice man. And it's fun to try to use his language.
Are you as bothered as I am by anachronisms?
Oh yeah, yes I am. I try not. I hope not to have them in there. Yes I am bothered.
I know it's a controversial topic, but I wanted to mention the television show The Irregulars. I don't know if you've seen it.
I have.
It's. My poor wife. I talk to the screen a lot. And
I can imagine this one.
Yeah, this one, sort of, it was like, oh my God, she said the word clone.
Yeah.
It's like, well, clones hadn't been invented for 10 years, and so on. But
the very
that
first
sort of thing.
The very first line of dialogue wasn't this, but it was something like, "What's up with you?" Or it was a total vernacular, modern vernacular. The very first line of dialogue in that entire show. But
yeah, I wasn't bothered. I certainly wasn't bothered by what the show did with Holmes and Watson. That's fine. use your imagination, come up with different relationships and all that. But, you know, if you're going to do a show that's set in Victorian England, first of all, how did she expect, why do all these people know how to read? Where did this young woman who has been raised, who's an orphan, learn to read? That's never explained. But anyway, those things bother me. I wanted to just shake the screenwriters by the neck and say, you know, couldn't you at least talk to somebody? Couldn't you? You've gone through this yourself. You're a screenwriter. I mean, I'm always annoyed. It's like, couldn't you have somebody else actually read this and tell you there's a plot hole or a big mistake here or whatever? The film studios don't care about that. You know, it's like, this is our movie. It's, you know.
Well, yes. I would imagine you know about that even more than I do, Les, because you've been a consultant on some things. And,
yes.
You know, they ask you, but they may not take your advice.
That's right. And, you know, within limits, that's fine. I don't mind them not taking my advice about plot devices, things like that. My favorite story is about the address, and that when it first came on the screen in one of these films, it was 221B. And I said, everyone knows it's not 221B, it's 221. And B would have been the apartment number. And they said,
yes, exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. They always put 221B on the door as if that's the, you know, building address. Yeah.
That's right. Where A is maybe the garage or something. I don't know
what. Yeah. But it's very typical in these Georgian buildings, which are the ones that are, you know, like 221B.
Well, that's a good segue. I was going to ask you, has being in England, I mean, you've basically been in England for the last 14 months now, 15 months, something like that.
Yeah, yes.
Has it changed your perspective on these books at all, or and sort of, and about Sherlockians? I mean, you've been dealing with lots of Holmesians, as we say, instead of as well as American Sherlockians. In the beginning, we were much more nutty about Sherlock Holmes than they were. We, the Americans, were much more nutty than the English.
Yes.
Has that changed, do you think? You've been one of the leaders sort of dragging them into being nuts.
Well, I didn't take much dragging. I think there's a different brand of nuttiness in the two Sherlockian camps. I mean, so, for example, the English Sherlockians like to dress up in Victorian gear and go on trips together.
Yes.
So I haven't seen the Americans do that. That's a certain brand of, you know,
well, some Americans have gone on those trips, but
yes, they have. But you know, in other words, everybody here, they have a particular way of intensely, you know, focusing. But they're very much about the game, very, very much about it. So and the love is there. So it's slightly different flavor, but it's very similar, really. I think, you know, the BSI is super organized and it's bigger, far bigger in terms of membership. You know, you got to realize, of course, the country is a lot bigger, so there's more people to draw from. But
I think what's bigger here is the local societies. There are a few local societies in England that I'm aware of, but it's the local groups that are much more intense and much more organized here than in England. The BSI, you know, don't give us too much credit. You know, it's 300 members around the world, 300 international members, and we only really do one activity a year.
Yeah, but the difference, Les, is that the BSI is invitation only, and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London is you just join. Anyone can just join. So they have a larger number of members, but, you know, maybe the fanatic ratio is different. Whereas BSI members are all fanatics because you wouldn't be in it.
Well, I guess that's right, because it's selective.
Right, and they're all people who have, you know, evinced in some way some immense interest and expertise in something pertaining to it. But you know, here it's more of a, you know, if you like it and you'd like to do some of these events, great. But you know, I've noticed I'm active with the Crime Writers Association here as well. And People are less joiners over here. So I'm one of the conveners for the London branch of the CWA, and it's really hard to get people to come to the meetings. It's just, of course, right now
Well,
nobody can come.
I'm not sure it's that
Virtual.
different. I mean, Mystery Writers of America, just for comparison, which is like 3,500, 4,000 members, has 11 chapters. They're regional. And for example, I mean, I was the president of the SoCal chapter for 4 years. We had 350 members, of which 35 attended a meeting on
Right.
regularly.
So I guess it is. Maybe that's a function of writers being kind of solo voyagers,
Well,
Maybe.
I think that one of the I mean, without exaggerating, the good parts of the lockdown and the pandemic has been that people are attending meetings virtually now that they never would have bothered to go
Yes.
to, or they couldn't get to personally. I've
Yeah.
gone to both Sherlockian gatherings, horror writer gatherings, mystery writer gatherings with people attending from all over the world, that never would have
Right.
done that in person. And
And
also,
you were
maybe
just
here you are. Here you are in Scottsdale
Scottsdale,
today, and in Texas tomorrow, and I don't know where else you're going, but
New York
that's
last night.
that just
Yeah,
hasn't been, that wasn't possible with physical touring.
it
And
is definitely true. Yeah, you just gave the sort of the keynote speech at the big event in London. So
it was great. I would have rather been there, but
next time, though. Yeah,
I was happy to be there virtually. So
yeah.
what can we do? I mean, except look at the doors that have opened. These are positive things now that we're getting
Yes,
to
yes,
see more
definitely.
people. So
Yeah.
back to research. You do a lot of research about a lot of things. I mean, for example, you're now a world expert on single malt Scotch. It was difficult
That was a
research,
tough subject.
very
Yeah.
unpleasant, I know.
Yeah, tough, really tough.
But so most of our writer friends suffer because they love the research and then they throw away 95% of it because you can't put it in the book because it's boring. So I always say, well, I never throw away anything. I put it into a footnote. You have gotten sneaky and you've started using footnotes too.
Well, I'm sneaky inspired by you, Les. Definitely. I love annotations. I love every Sherlockian, you see a picture of them in their office and they have, I don't know if you can see, I'm going to knock this over, but your 3 volumes are just right there. So every Sherlockian has your volumes with all the annotations. And I love those because they illuminate the time and place. And so I wanted that for mine, but I also think in a novel, a novel you buy to read for pleasure, it's intrusive. So I put them on my website, and they're definitely inspired by you, Les. But I love to
I'm
write
flattered.
little things about the times, the places, and the times, and pictures of things, and funny little things like it's during a heat wave. The Three Locks takes place during a heat wave, and so I talk about what a Victorian ice box looked like, where they would get their ice. It was really expensive, how it would come to them, and what fan Watson might have been using because they sure didn't have air conditioning, or even big fans unless you were in India, and they had a kind that servants would
Right,
walk
would pull the
over you.
rope and the fan would go up and down,
Yeah,
or
so
back and forth. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So people are
Oh, it's
interested in this
fascinating. Well,
stuff.
you're dealing with the same things that make me want to write annotations, which is this is a foreign country. Not only is
Yes,
it
yes.
for American readers, it's England, but it's also a foreign country for everyone because we're talking about events taking place almost 150 years ago,
Yeah,
when life was
yeah.
very different.
Yes, it
And
was.
some of the things that were obvious, I mean, when you read the original stories, and since you're trying to capture that flavor, things that were obvious to the Victorian average person in Victoria are not obvious to us.
Right.
I point out, for example, in Dracula, there's an insignificant scene where Lucy Westenra and her mother go to see some neighbors and they leave their visiting cards.
Yeah.
What was that?
Right,
It was
right.
a Victorian thing that nobody would have thought twice about. Of course, you leave your card because that's
Yes,
what you
right.
did.
Mhm.
So,
Exactly.
well, good. So we have more footnotes coming in the new one. So I wanted to ask you about the Sherlockian aspects of Tron.
I wanted to point
There's a,
She's
out,
thank
holding
you,
up.
Barbara.
just
There's a
hang on
footnote.
1 second. I wanted to point out that in the back of the book, there's actually the online, the URL for this, for interesting facts and photos of people, places and things mentioned in the novel and annotations. And then you go here and they do give you the URL for Bonnie's, all of that. So you don't, if you're listening to this, don't panic if you didn't write it down, because it's safely there in the
In the
book.
book, good. And you should buy a copy of the book just to get the URL. We
That's
wouldn't
right.
want to like put it in a link or anything. You know, that would be easy. So Tron, tell us about the Sherlockian aspects of Tron.
The Sherlockian aspects of Tron.
There must have been things. I mean, we could play. I already did my 6 Degrees of Separation. Of course, you know, it starred David Warner, who not
Yes.
only did he actually play Arthur Conan Doyle in a film in the 90s about Houdini, he also, of course, was Jack the Ripper in
Oh,
Time After Time, which is about Jack the Ripper and H.G. Wells, and just happens to have been written by a mutual friend of ours, the Sherlockian Nicholas Meyer. So there's deep connections here to Tron. You obviously
Right.
started it all for David Warner.
you know, I've never thought of the movie or the story of Tron in that way, I have to be honest. But except for this, maybe, the character of Tron he's a computer program, he's a video game program. But he wants to be more. He has hubris, he wants to be more. And so but he's very logical, because programs are programmed in a very specific way to go through their little tracks, and he's trying to expand and one of he's trying to learn, this, I don't know, this didn't really make it into the final film, but the original concept of him is he would like to be human. And so he was trying to acquire what was human, basically, about it. And the bit was could only say yes or no. Bits are only positive or negative. So in the sense, the whole notion of computer science and logic is not really alien to, you know, to the Holmesian attraction to logic. And
Right.
so there is a connection there, I guess.
I think you're going to have to write a whole paper about this, Bonnie. So
A very short one.
so can we ask you to read something from the book for us? Does that make sense? Or Barbara, is that okay with you?
Well, I think that would be lovely. Before we see if Patrick has questions, if Bonnie would like to read a little bit, that would be terrific.
Okay, I didn't prepare this.
Unprepared as you are. I mean, the problem is always that when I get asked to read, it's like, okay, which footnote am I going to read? You know, so.
How long of a read do you want? Because I'm trying to.
Well, let's see. We're at Patrick. Do you have questions for us?
Here he
I don't
comes.
see.
Howdy.
I don't see anything in the chat. Have we had any questions?
Well, not too many questions, but actually I have a couple of questions whenever you're ready to.
So
entertain.
Bonnie, maybe 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yes, everybody watching on Facebook, if you have questions, please send them in. Now's the time.
Okay.
Everyone can see how well rehearsed we are here. So
Yeah, I had no idea.
It's an informal event with no run of show.
I really had no idea you were going to ask me this. So let's see. Okay.
or you could just say, look, there's nothing here that's worth reading. You know, it's
Okay. No, I'm just trying to figure out which thing to read. Let's see. Okay. All right. This is chapter. I'm going to read this from chapter 3, and starts at chapter 3. So Watson has, it's been a heat wave, and Watson gets this box, and he and Holmes have quarreled, and Watson has just gone off on a little trip to Bath, and just he needed to get out of the flat and away from Holmes. And when he comes back, this is what he finds. Okay. 10 days later, even though lowering clouds darkened London with the promise of a summer storm, my mood was light as I returned in a cab from Paddington Station towards Baker Street. My extended holiday in Bath had been restorative. Given Holmes's disputatious and dismissive mood of late, it was a welcome break to spend time with James Montgomery, a fellow soldier whom I'd known in India, and 2 other comrades, whose ready laughter and playful demeanours had lifted my spirits. Despite Holmes's ill-placed concern, I had won a fair amount of money at cards, and while the best locksmith in Bath could do nothing with the mysterious box, I was sure a London expert would soon have it open. And so I had allowed myself to enjoy the baths every day and partook of a wonderful cuisine, roast beef, oysters, champagne. A dense tropical heat blanketed Baker Street. My medical colleagues who still believed in the miasmic transfer of disease were likely to be frantic at this weather. As my cab pulled up to 221, I glanced up at our windows. The curtains were closed against the morning light, which was muted through a canopy of summer storm clouds. But the windows, too, were closed. That was odd. Just as I descended from the carriage, the sky broke open and a torrent of rain dumped down as though some mischievous god had upended an enormous bucket on Baker Street. "Mrs. Hudson!" I exclaimed, greeting our landlady as she glided into the vestibule, but instead of her usual warm response, she took my drenched hat and coat wordlessly, her face cloudier than the sky outside. While I may see but not observe, as my friend so often remarked, it would be difficult for any man to miss her distinct aura of reproach. "Dreadful weather," I put on my best smile, "but it is supposed to break the heat. Good to be home. How are you, Mrs. Hudson?" "Just going up, Doctor. It's been a challenging 2 weeks." 10 days, Mrs. Hudson." "Well, it seems a month. Go to see him." She disappeared downstairs. That was hardly the welcome I had expected. I passed the sitting room and the first-floor landing, and the door was shut. Upstairs in my room, I set down my luggage and took out the small silver box from my mother. It gleamed in the morning light from my window, its tantalizing mystery intact. I locked the beautiful object in my drawer, thinking I'd find the right locksmith tomorrow. I was not ready for what I found downstairs. First thing my eyes were drawn to was the floor, awash in clutter, inches deep with scattered papers, stained napkins, dirty ashtrays, pipe bottles, plates of dried food, and random oddities. A box of snakeskins sat next to a carafe of something that looked like dried blood. Flies swarmed around it. Mrs. Hudson had clearly withdrawn her usual services, no doubt in one of her rare fits of pique. And the room was as hot as a tea kettle on full boil, yet a fire burned in the grate. Why? A gust of wind just then shot down the chimney, and a spray of sparks escaped and landed on a pile of papers. One ignited, and I ran to it, just in time to toss the smoldering paper into the fireplace before it set the room afire. I drew the fire screen across it. A near disaster. But that gust down the flue meant a breeze, so I next rushed to the windows and opened 2 of them against the stifling heat. The violent summer storm continued to pour down rain, but why was the room closed up like this? And where was Holmes? I turned to look, and that is when I discovered him, hanging silently in a corner of the room. His body dangled from a rope and was suspended 4 feet off the floor. He was encased from the knees up in a straitjacket. One foot was bare, the other slippered. The bare foot wriggled. He was alive, at least. I stared at him a long moment. He frowned in concentration and began moving silently under the canvas of the restraint. It was a rather elaborate contraption, tightly bound with leather straps and buckles fastened with padlocks. The toes of his bare foot wriggled in concert with his efforts. He must have seen me come in. I cleared my throat. Nothing. "Holmes?" "Yes." "Why the fire?" "Is that the first question you have, Watson?" "Yes, why the fire?" I was cold. "In this weather, are you eating?" "Burning papers." A plate of sandwiches sat untouched next to his chair. His movements into the straitjacket now involved his legs hanging in the air, jerking from side to side. "Who helped you into that?" I asked. "Billy." The page. A predicament of Holmes' own devising, then. A minute passed. It did not look like he was making headway. A bead of sweat ran down his forehead and into his eye. He shook it away and smiled at me. "You won in Bath, then. Tidy sum," he said. "What? For heaven's sake, Holmes, type in handsome one from here. But it's not like you to purchase adornments. Stop this. Nobody likes to be scrutinized in this way. You're usually amused. Never mind. What the devil are you doing there? I'm attempting to replicate the great Borelli's hanging escape trick. I've almost got it, I think.
Very nice, buddy.
That was great.
Very, very dramatically delivered. I like that.
Oh,
It's the screenwriter who always has a cast member in mind, I assume. So who's going to play Holmes and Watson in your film, or at least in the film in your head?
oh, I don't know. I like lots of different actors, but they're young. They're in their 30s, and they're very handsome.
Excellent. So Patrick, you had a couple of questions you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I mean, you've addressed some of this, but I'm glad both of you are here to weigh in. How important is the time period in which Holmes, arose? What was the kind of what was going on in the air that people responded to so much with these stories? And kind of that's a big question, I realize, but also, who are Holmes's antecedents? Who came before Holmes? Tell me a little bit about that. Who was it? The rise of Scotland Yard? Was it, or was he truly
How much time do we have?
a complete original? Because he's such an archetype now, and I was just wondering who came before Holmes.
Les, you want to do that one?
Sure. Well, the short answer is who came before Holmes is no one, in the sense of an amateur consulting detective. That was pretty much original to Holmes. The idea that somebody could pursue a profession as a consulting detective. We have police detectives and we have amateurs who are caught up in a case. First of all, let's put this in perspective. We have no police force, no constabulary in England until the first part of the 19th century. Nothing. I mean, we're talking about village, constables or the watchmen, and no official police. Then we have the rise of the police, starting sort of first third of the 19th century and for the rest of the century. But we don't even have inspectors, a detective force, until the 1850s or 1860s in England. So there aren't police working these kinds of cases, and we don't have any fiction about them. The first mystery novels appear really in the 1860s, in the early 1860s. And they fall, the characters are of two types. We have people like Inspector Bucket, created by Charles Dickens. Or we have characters like the sergeant, whose name has gone right out of my head, appearing in Wilkie Collins's novels, Sergeant Cuff. These are official detectives, and they're pretty good. There are also amateurs involved who are family members or friends of the victims who sort of get caught up in these cases, but there's nobody like Sherlock Holmes until Doyle came up with that idea.
Wow.
But to answer another part of that question, you asked sort of what was going on in the world that affected these stories, and one of the things is that just prior to this, the whole lifestyle, everyone's lifestyle shifted with the advent of a massive rail system throughout England. So suddenly people were traveling a lot more. That brought tons of people to London. London was popping with population and it was a very exciting place. It was also the financial center of the world. But also then a lot of medical advancements were happening right then at the end of the 19th century. But
it was also dangerous. That very same rail travel meant that you didn't know your neighbors, because
True.
your neighbors might live 30 miles away and have popped into town on the train. So you didn't have the small village where everybody could sort of watch each other and take care of each other.
Right, that's definitely true. But there was, of course, a lot more communication now. The mail system had just really gone sky high. I mean, I think was it 5 times a day less? You got the mail
Yeah,
delivery
5 or 6
at your
times a day. Absolutely.
yeah.
Now, it was also a time, and this is important for you and Barbara, Patrick, it was a time that reading really blossomed. Because, again, we have, in the early parts of the 19th century, reading is a pastime of the rich. They're the ones who could afford books. And slowly, with the
serials,
the broadsheets being circulated, and then eventually the pulp magazines and books, and the rise of the beacons, the middle schools, the board schools, as the middle class was getting education, was learning to read, we had a tremendous spread of reading. Plus, again, the railroads. So the railroads meant that you had time sitting on a train or standing on a train with nothing to do for the duration of the train ride. So you would buy a magazine or a newspaper or a yellowback novel to entertain yourself on the train. So we had a tremendous growth in the reading public and an appetite for reading material.
The rise of the middle class and the upper middle class that didn't really exist so much before. There were a lot of more educated people who moved to London and had, jobs in banks and in law. They were law clerks and, et cetera. And they were, so they were like a new kind of upper middle class, and a lot of
class,
building.
maybe.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly
Professional
right.
class, I think you'd call it. Yeah.
Yes, that's.
So
that's exactly
I say also that every revolution of the 20th century, whichever ones you want to look at, they started here. They started in the 1890s, basically, maybe a little earlier in some cases. Whether we're talking about civil rights or the rights of women, or the spread of education, computer science, all of those things started then. And so that makes it a very exciting time to read about as well.
Well, it's interesting to compare and contrast what's going on in the UK and what's going on in America. I mean, it's the end of the frontier period, and then you have the Pinkertons and Burns detective agencies, kind of in their starting, maybe a little bit earlier. But also you get there's this big flowering of imaginative literature coming out, with Dracula, Dr. Hyde, and as Bonnie was talking about, medical advancements. And isn't this the period where, the body snatcher phenomenon was happening in England? And
earlier, really, but
was it?
It was back
in the 19th century, certainly.
One of the
other things I think is very noteworthy about 19th century fiction, and this is important to me, having done a whole bunch of anthologies, is that you'll see a lot of the same writers. I mean, we just put out, for example, in the Haunted Library, actually, when I say just put out, I think it's now on shelves, a collection called The Parasite and Other Tales of Terror by Arthur Conan Doyle. By the way, the Haunted Library of Horror Classics is a publication of the Poison Pen Press, I should say. But the point I was going to make is the great writers of the age did not think of themselves as genre writers. They did not think of themselves as writers of romance or horror or science fiction or mysteries or whatever. They wrote what they felt like. And so you have, if you look at some of my anthologies, you'll see some of the same writers appearing in a mystery anthology and also in a horror anthology. And because that's what they did. And the fiction magazines of the day were not specific to genre. They were magazines of good fiction, and they had all kinds.
What do you think about Sherlock Holmes as far as can that character really work as well in a modern setting? I know it's been attempted so many times, but what's your take on that? Do you think he's most effective in the environment in which he was created?
Are you asking me that? I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that.
Sure, you answer it, Bonnie.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a good question. I mean, you're asking, is he really a creature of his times? And yeah, I think he is. However, I would also say that personality and the traits and the mystery of the man are so powerful that there have been, I think, some good modern versions. One of my favorites is House, actually, which took a lot of character traits from Sherlock Holmes, a lot of personality, but and a lot of methodology, and translated it to a modern day doctor. So, I think that was a tremendously successful use or transfer into modern time. I also really liked BBC Sherlock. I think Les, you're as big a fan as I am, but
not so much. But I would point to
Yeah.
CBS's Elementary as another wonderful example of translating the character into contemporary time, where we have a very serious drug addiction issue running throughout those stories, and a contemporary view of the illness and the difficulties of dealing with it, as opposed to the naive views expressed in the original canon. Is
Well,
it easy?
the
Can
views
you
of
write
the
these
time,
mysteries?
Sorry?
Well, we already talked a little bit, Patrick, about the difficulties of deductions in modern times compared to deductions in the 19th century. And so that's often a weakness of moving the character. But I think that when you strip away the specifically Victorian characteristics of Holmes, you look at the principal characteristics, it works perfectly. You've got a person, I started to say a man, but it certainly doesn't have to be a man, a person who is devoted not to law enforcement, but to justice, and who uses not coincidence, not a broad network of law enforcement officials, but his own reason and the occasional help of a friend to figure things out. Observation is observation. Doesn't work any less well in the 21st century than in the 19th century. There are different things to observe, maybe less to observe.
That's probably
The other thing, the other thing that people leave out when I think sometimes when they talk about Holmes is that he had amassed a body of very specific knowledge that applied to what he was doing. Now nowadays that subset of stuff would be much larger and harder to amass, but more available via computer. More you could pull it up, and so it's a different thing. But the knowledge that this man had was as important as his reasoning ability, I think. So he had all the files in his office, but they were very specifically curated files that helped what he was doing. So I think you can have a character in modern times that has done that has amassed a body of very specific expertise in things. So and then again, but it's more of it is available online. So I think it makes. But you have to know how to search. Not everybody is equal on the internet. There are people who can find things much better than others.
One of
That's
my
a particular
favorite, by the
skill.
way, I was reminded the other day of one of my favorite contemporary Sherlock Holmes stories, which nobody remembers anymore, which was a film called Zero Effect with Bill Pullman and Ben Stiller. And a brilliant film about Mr. Zero, who is Sherlock Holmes, clearly, who is a contemporary, he's a computer geek. He basically operates out of a room. He hardly ever leaves his house. On cases, and it's an excellent retelling of one of the Holmes stories. I won't spoil it because if I identified the story, it would spoil the film. But it's a terrific film, and if you haven't seen it, you should check it out.
I think Joe Ide's IQ series is a terrific update based on what you're both talking about. And Bonnie, I never thought about House, but yeah, what a perfect. And somebody in the notes field was asking what is the House book that Bonnie just mentioned, and it's not a book; it's a TV series with Hugh Laurie, correct?
Right.
As a doctor who has
and Dr. Wilson, his companion.
His friend, right?
Yeah. No, what a great
House.
And he does have a drug
Wilson.
problem, and he's kind of damaged goods, but he's a brilliant man.
That's the thing.
And of course, the Locardian principle, which was not even really enunciated before Holmes. Until after Holmes, that there are things to be seen at crime scenes. There are interactions between the people that are there and the physical environment. obviously very, very much a part of modern forensic science. So a contemporary Holmes would embrace the new science, but there's nothing about Sherlock Holmes that doesn't work in contemporary times.
There's that complicated psyche. When I think of Holmes, that's what I think of, sort of the tortured soul in a way. That
Well,
we can all relate
the
to.
huge difference between contemporary crime fiction and the Sherlock Holmes stories is, Michael Connelly is quoted. It's actually Joseph Wambaugh's line about that we're more interested in how the cop works the case than we're more interested in how the case works the cop than how the cop works the case. And so the Holmes stories are not as devoted to understanding the growth and changes in Sherlock Holmes, but he does change. That's one of the lovely things about the 60 stories is you see this period of time between Holmes as a brash young man in cases like the Musgrave Ritual or the Gloria Scott or even A Study in Scarlet, and a mature man by the time we get to stories like His Last Bow. He's aged, he's now 35 years older, basically. Older, almost 45 years older in those cases. So he's a different person. And Doyle was one of the very first to do that. He had the luxury, he wrote 60 stories. So he could do that. He could explore the arc of the character.
Patrick, are there any questions that people have brought in?
No, just that one gentleman about the house show.
Aha, okay. Well, Bonnie, I have a question, which is, when you settle down to write your bucket list novel, to write a novel, and you love this period, you gave yourself an extra problem because you could have just written a Victorian story and you wouldn't have had to conform it to all the expectations of all the Sherlock Holmes fans and so forth. But as it is, you've not only got to get the history part right, but you have people so steeped in the canon and so versed in Sherlock Holmes, that it's kind of like a Knives Out from the very beginning kind of a thing. So did you embrace that? Was that an extra challenge for you, that you set yourself up to write a novel that was going to be critiqued not only from an historical standpoint, but from all the people who were already Sherlockians?
Yes, I was actually quite terrified about that. But I also, especially, less like this. Oh my God. Really, seriously. And one of the first things I did, Barbara, was this was quite a bit before I sat down to write this, but I had wanted to write one. I started one like a few years prior and then tabled it. And I went to see Les, and I think I invited you to lunch, and I asked you, okay, what are your pet peeves in reading a Sherlock Holmes pastiche? And you were like, well, I hate them anyway. I don't really like them. But then you said your pet peeve was there's too much talk about food. And then from that I realized, okay, this is totally idiosyncratic. Everybody's going to bring something else to the reading here that they don't like or they don't want to see in Sherlock Holmes. And I knew that you cannot please all Sherlockians for sure. So then I just decided, okay, I'm going to be a stickler and do the best I can do.
Right. Well, we're kind of used here to legacy writers that where somebody has already created a universe. Let's say Clive Cussler, who was, our author for 30 years, and there's a whole Cussler-verse that he created, right, with characters in it and dynamics and so forth. And, other people work in it and have continued it. And there's a Sherlock Holmes universe, and there's a Jane Austen universe. And, I think it's so interesting that people get so caught up in these fictional universes that they become real, and, that they choose to lead part of their lives, in fact, in worlds that were created entirely by an author. I just find it completely fascinating. And I think that's one reason there is a lot of legacy publishing right now, is that people are not prepared to let characters go. But, you know, when Parker died, people didn't want to lose Spencer. When Clive died, people wanted to keep Dirk Pitt. You know, without Doyle, people still love Sherlock Holmes and want to see him. So there are writers working in various universes, but I've always thought the Sherlockian ones might be the toughest, which is nicer than saying the pickiest, isn't it, Les?
Yes. Well, Bonnie, do you actually get letters or emails from people saying you made a mistake? You know, this is.
Oh yes. Oh, of course. Oh yes. And you know, yeah, I do. Fortunately, not too many. But somebody took me to task in this last book, saying I had somebody traveling several blocks, and they don't just say that in English. This is totally American. You know, it's obviously American. It's like, oh my God, you know. And so I looked this up, and no, they do say we go round the block, and this is a block, but streets are not laid out in grids here, so you don't technically say that exact thing often, but they do say block. So you know, yes, people are very, very, very particular. But let me go back to the sort of a basic part of the question you asked, Barbara, which is, you know, when you want to emulate somebody, it's not just the universe, it's not just the character, but it's also the style. When I wrote my novel, It's in a Drawer, my first novel I wrote, my hero was Robert Parker. And in fact, I lived only a few blocks from him in Cambridge, Mass. And we'd met him a couple of times. He was my hero, and I went and got his PhD thesis out of the library at Boston University, and he wrote it about mystery writing. And I emulated certain things about his style when I wrote the first book, which was really short chapters, and a few other things. But yes, I mean, I think when people are incredibly effective, you know, we're wise to emulate them. It's not copying. It's good practice, really. So, you know, I have to go back to that and say, you know, emulate away.
Well, I think that's a lovely way to conclude this. So thank you both very much. Bonnie, always a pleasure to see you. I'm glad this is fourth time, and we'll look forward to the fifth. And Leslie, thank you once again for
Always a pleasure.
Oh,
Thank you,
please.
thank
It's
you,
always
Leslie.
a joy to talk to you, and in so many different aspects of the world too, but right today Sherlockian. So Patrick, thanks for your great service. Thank you all for watching the program. Do remember that the 3 locks, and we do have book plates that Bonnie has sent us from England for your enjoyment. So bye. Thanks for joining us.
Out for now.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks
Barbara.
everybody
Thank
for
you.
watching.